Well, hey there, you're listening to the Brief and Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host Scott Crockett and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. On this episode, we're talking all things Alberta's economy going into 2022. BCA's economists Alicia Planincic and Mike Holden join me and Scott to break down BCA's recent quarterly economic update, the Alberta Snapshot. And we're discussing everything from strong commodity prices and persistent labor shortages to what's happening with inflation these days and when we may be able to resume normal daily activities such as going to the cinema or even back to the office. Well, welcome back to another episode of The Brief. I'm joined today by three of my colleagues. Scott Crockett is my host for this series, as well as Alicia Planincic, our Manager of Policy and Economics, and Mike Holden, our Vice President of Policy and Chief Economist. And we're going to nerd out on some economics for the next few minutes. So our topic today is last week's release of the January 2022 edition of the Alberta Snapshot, which for those of our listeners who don't know what that is, this is an overview, a quarterly overview that BCA puts out that just highlights what's happening in Alberta's economy. You know, we take a lot of economic information and distill it down into a story that hopefully helps you keep the pulse on the things that you need to know about how our economy is doing. And Alicia and Mike are here to help break down some of the numbers in our latest release. So welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
I really read this edition of the Alberta Snapshot with interest. And I think this is one that, although it goes kind of far and wide into Alberta's economy, there were sort of two big headlines that were really interesting, and that to me at least, and that's that in many ways, the Alberta economy seems back to normal, by many measures of pre-COVID activity, but normal life sure isn't back to normal. So maybe we can start with the first of those big headlines and talk about the Alberta economy. It really appears that there's every indication that Alberta is experiencing a really robust rebound. Can you give us a sense of how bullish you are on the province looking at 2022 and what's driving the more positive indicators?
Sure. Well, you're right to say that 2021 was a strong year for the Alberta economy. We saw a strong rebound in a lot of areas. And there are a few specific things that are happening here. The first one is that, just by way of a quick tangent, 2020 was a particularly bad year in Alberta. And
right.
so part of what we're seeing here is a rebound effect, because it's, in a sense, it's like the harder you fall, the easier it is to snap back up. But at the same time, there's some very real and very positive things that are happening in the province. And so last year, there are two main ones that I'd highlight, I think. One is higher than expected commodity prices. I mean, everybody knows that crude oil is was far higher in 2021 than it was the previous year. The provincial budget, just by way of example, last year had forecast that the WTI price of crude oil would be around $45 a barrel. And of course, it's been, over $60 a barrel throughout much of the year, approaching 70 and 80 at times. And so
right, as we record this, it's 85, right? Which, it may not stay at that level, but that's a huge difference.
But it's significantly higher than anybody was expecting at about the same time last year. And so that higher prices plus higher production levels have really driven a lot of gains on the oil and gas side. And then we've also seen strong prices in lumber, which have helped our forestry industry. And so that sort of commodity price boom, even agricultural prices are high, even though we had a not the best crop year in 2021, prices were high enough to at least offset part of that struggle. And so that commodity price was really, the commodity price environment was really a strong wind in Alberta sales last year. And the second point that I'd highlight, I think, is the housing market. So we had new home builds in the province were up about 28% from last year. And this is a phenomenon that we've seen across the country. And Alberta was joined a bit late to the game, but we've really seen a boom in residential housing. Building permits have been high and have recovered quite strongly. And so we're seeing this kind of confidence in the Alberta's housing market and in the economy in general. I think that's really what's brought us through 2021. And, looking ahead, I think one of the reasons why economists are bullish on the future is that one of the other things that happened last year was there were a lot of very positive major project announcements that came out at various points through the year. So we had Air Products had their $1.3 billion net zero hydrogen production facility was announced. Dow Chemicals had a $10 billion net zero ethylene cracker announced. ATCO and Suncor are working on a multi-billion-dollar hydrogen project. There's a $700 million solar farm that's under construction, the largest in Canada, north of Lethbridge. And that, in addition to that being its own project, it also helped to attract Amazon to set up a cloud computing hub in Calgary. And so we saw all these announcements. And to be fair, most of these are not actually going to influence economic growth next year because they'll take a while to get started and get rolling. But it is buoying optimism on Alberta's future for 2022 and for subsequent years.
What a difference a year makes. Hey, it's just a completely different story than when we were having these conversations last year. I want to zoom in on one thing that you asked there before we get into or one thing you mentioned there before we get into the nitty gritty. Why do economists care so much about new home builds? Why is that such a meaningful indicator? When there's other things you could look at in the real estate market, and probably relatively few people who are involved in the real estate market are buying a truly new home in any given year.
Well, I think partly it's because of the importance that the new home builds have to the construction sector. So construction is a very large component of the Alberta economy. It's it employs about, I think it's around 9 or 10% of Albertans are employed in construction. And that's about 2 or 3 percentage points higher than it is in other provinces. So construction is a big industry in Alberta. And so that's one of the factors. And I think also it's because it is an indication of confidence that Albertans are feeling secure enough in their jobs and their wages that they want to buy new homes. It means that people are moving into the province.
Migration, that kind of occurred to me as well.
There are a range of factors that make this an important indicator.
Yeah, sort of indicates that if you need more new homes, then that's an indicator that your population is likely growing. And that's one of the things I think we've also seen is that the net migration numbers are beginning to really turn around, with Alberta seeing some net in migration. I wanted to unpack just a couple of the points deeper underneath the economic numbers. Talk to me about public sector employment, what's happening there.
Yeah, so this is one of the ones that I think underscores why it's important to not just look at the top line number, but also kind of peel back the layers and look underneath. Basically, what we've seen is a growth in the public sector of about 22,000. So about 22,000 more Albertans are working in the public sector now than they were prior to the pandemic. And what's interesting about this number is this is just enough to offset the losses in the private sector, right? So in the absence of this growth, we'd basically be seeing this pretty big deficit. And so one thing to keep in mind as we look into the upcoming year is those jobs, most of them are likely not permanent, right? There are folks that are related, helping out with contact tracing, vaccine administration, et cetera. So we're really going to need to see more private sector growth to fill that gap once those jobs go away.
I agree with you on half of that. I think we totally do need to see the private sector growth, and we'll have to wait and see on the other half, which is I'm not so sure if those public sector jobs are as impermanent as they may seem for a couple of reasons. It's been my experience that public sector jobs once created tend to last. And also I think Canadians' level of expectation around their healthcare has increased over the course of this. And so we may see more resources flowing to public sector areas, particularly something like healthcare, to even just have higher capacity in the system long term.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good point, but I think we're going to have to weigh that against the budget or the province's very real budget constraints and trying to hold the line on certain metrics over the next few years. So I think you're absolutely right, but it's going to be a challenge.
I think an additional point that's worth highlighting here is that a lot of this private sector job growth weakness is still very concentrated in specific areas. So
right.
compared to other provinces, Alberta has not seen the same degree of recovery in some of these public-facing businesses like the bars, restaurants, hospitality industry type of jobs. Those have been slow to come back. And so we've seen, areas like construction, like, high-end services, finance, professional services, those jobs have come back and more, but we're still waiting on this, waiting on a full recovery in these public-facing hospitality industries.
Let's talk for a minute about something that's made news all over North America, people, workforce, and specifically resignations. We've seen discussion of the Great Resignation, particularly in the United States. What are we seeing in terms of retirements happening in Alberta and the impact that it's having on the labor market?
Yeah, so I think the whole resignation idea is, at least what we know thus far in Canada, when we look at the data, a little bit of a myth. But I do think there's some truth when we look at folks who are 55 and older. We've seen these folks leave the labor force. The big question, though, is it permanent? Right. So I think what we're already seeing in the US, for instance, is folks left, but now they're coming back, and they say to employers they're willing to come back for the right job and the right price. The question for us and our labor shortages currently in Alberta is, will we see the same here? Right. Because that is really the demographic that we're missing, is specifically men, interestingly, who are 55 and older, have left the labor force and not come back yet.
And we're hearing more and more discussion about labor shortages in Alberta. At first it was related to certain professions and skill sets and certain geographies. It occasionally seems more widespread. What's your kind of take on the labor shortage picture in Alberta at the moment? Have we tipped over, to use a real estate term? Are we into a seller's market at this stage now, where those with the labor have more power versus those who want to purchase it?
It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that it has a really succinct answer that we can give right now. We've had one thing I can point to is, so every 3 times a year we produce our business expectation survey, where we survey BCA member companies and member CEOs and entrepreneurs about what their expectations are for job growth, and as well we ask them about labor shortages, and specifically we ask whether they face any labor shortage that limits their ability to meet demand. And so 12 months ago, we had about 11% of businesses said yes, that they face labor shortages. And in our most recent survey, which was in November, that number was all the way up to 73%. So that's a huge number of businesses that are not finding the workers they need. And why that is, there are a couple of different reasons for this. And I think one of them is really related to COVID and COVID-related uncertainty. And that's something that I think we're going to see a lot more of in the next few months, because we're not really sure how the effect of this rampant Omicron variant is going to affect workplaces. So we've got businesses who may want to find workers and people that are unwilling or unable to work, either because they're sick or because they don't want to go into the workplace. We have, struggles with some industries in terms of whether they allow vaccinated or unvaccinated workers. That's a major factor that's contributing to this. And then the others were things that Alicia was talking about earlier, retirement movement, people, also taking this opportunity to rethink their lives and decide what it is they want to do. Maybe they're unhappy with where they are. And so there's some labor market uncertainty there as well. And I guess there's, on top of all of that, there's this whole issue of whether or not businesses and workers in Alberta have the right match of skills. So one of the sort of overarching concerns that we have, or that we're issues that we're watching for, is whether or not this fact that businesses are saying they can't find the people they need, and we still have relatively high unemployment in Alberta. It's at 7.3% as of December, and so the question then arises: do we have a cohort of workers who no longer have the types of skills that businesses are looking for, and vice versa? And if so, that's could be a major contributor to this concern about labor shortages.
Mm-hmm. The other thing, when I read the report, the other thing that I found just really interesting, and I've been telling everybody that I know about this because I find this fascinating, is this idea of normalcy and how close or far away we are from, what normalcy is. And this ended up getting included in the report. And basically the idea is that Canada, coming on 2 years of the pandemic, we're definitely not back to normal. Our daily activities are nowhere near, back to what was normal. In fact, we're actually moving the other way. The indicator I'm referring to here is the economist's normalcy index. First, explain kind of what a normalcy index is, what it's measuring, and then why this data matters so much in our overall kind of narrative around the pandemic. And then I guess the second question is, what is that story for Canada? Where do we stand on this, and why exactly are we getting so far away from, I guess, a pre-pandemic normal?
Yeah, so all good questions. And I have come to love this index. So this is called, as you said, the Normalcy Index. And this is something The Economist puts together basically tracking a pretty broad range of what I call high frequency indicators, which is information that we can collect almost in real time, right? So it's the total opposite of a figure like GDP, where we have to wait a whole quarter before we even know what's going on. This is very much in real time. What is kind of the daily activity in life look like across countries? And so they pull together a range of sort of separate indicators and roll it all up into one. And in the three categories really that they're looking at to define what is normal. So one is transportation and travel. So this includes things like flights, maybe traffic congestion as well. Number two is recreation and entertainment. So things like, are people going to the movies and to hockey games? And are they getting out of their house? And then the third category is retail and work. So it looks at, for instance, footfall in shops. It looks at occupancy of workplaces. Are folks still working from home, or are they mostly back to work? And as you say, what we see when we look at Canada is we're actually still pretty far away from what I would consider normal life. So our index on this measure is, we are ranked 44th of 50 countries that they measure, and our index is 62, meaning we're about 38% below normal. So anyway, I think this is a really important measure, in that I think it captures some of those quality of life and well-being things that are really not picked up in our traditional measures like GDP. So increasingly, I'm looking at this measure just as much, if not more, than those kind of traditional economic indicators.
What is the story in Canada that is giving us an index of 62? What's the story there, and who is there any jurisdiction that is back to normal?
I think there's kind of another underlying question of, will we even reach quote unquote normal? Will things like movie theater attendance ever get back to what it was? Right. So I think that's an important question to think in mind as well. But as far as why we're so low, or why we've seen a decline, it was really around the time of Omicron that we started to see a pretty big drop, especially in a couple of metrics that had actually already recovered. For instance, retail. So people were actually shopping in stores, going to malls almost exactly at the same rate that they were before the pandemic, up until Omicron. And then we see that tank, along with flights, right? We heard the federal government around that time started to discourage international travel. And we really do see that response picked up in the data. So people did change their behavior, whether it was due to restrictions or just because they were concerned. The virus is still ultimately in charge in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think too, in addition to that, we saw in this index a recent and fairly steep drop, and that's reflective of some of the measures that were taken in Ontario and in Quebec in particular. So this is it's a national index, and so Quebec imposed a curfew effectively on its citizens in a few weeks ago. And so that's something, because as Alicia said, this is almost real-time data that was very quick to be reflected in Canada's numbers.
So interesting to see that Canada is so far down the list in terms of returning to normalcy, even compared to a lot of other really comparable countries. And I think it'll be really interesting to follow how quickly things return to normal, or if they ever do. My personal bet is that things eventually will sort of begin to approach whatever normal was before, or something like it, but that it may take some time. And speaking of not normal, the next topic I wanted to move to was inflation. That's on the top of a lot of minds these days, on a lot of headlines of newspapers these days, and occupying a lot of ink. It's just been announced that inflation has hit a 30-year high in Canada at 4.8% from the most recent numbers. And I think it's important to note that being potentially concerned about inflation doesn't mean that some of the actions that got us here, notably income supports at some phase of the pandemic, weren't justified. But the concern over inflation may change where we want to go from here. So tell me how you're viewing this issue right now. What's your view of inflation in Canada? How concerned are you?
Well, it's a complicated situation. I think there's a lot of debate about how much we should be concerned about inflation right now. And levels of inflation, like it was 4.8%, as you mentioned, and the previous 2 months were around 4.7% each. And so those are high numbers. The Bank of Canada tries to keep inflation at around the 2% range. So it's more than twice that level. And I'd say there's three main factors that are driving this spike in inflation we're seeing right now. The first one of those is that at this same time last year, or in 2020, we saw the opposite happen. People stayed home. They weren't out shopping. They weren't buying anything. And there was a discount. The prices fell as a result of that. And so part of what we're seeing now is when prices fall 12 months later, if they return to normal, it's going to post a very high inflation number because the year over year difference is so large. And so that kind of snapback is one of the components of this inflation increase. A second one is what we talked about earlier, which was the large increase in crude oil and natural gas prices. And so that affects a large number of components here, not just gasoline prices that we pay at the pumps. It also filters through into things like higher transportation costs, which then filters through into, the cost of food, because the delivery costs are going to be higher. And so that's a second component. And that one I expect will moderate over time because, as the year over year impact of that increase in crude oil prices filters through, we won't see as large an increase going forward. But the third one is probably the most concerning and the most potentially lingering. And that's the impact that COVID in this entire year and a half, or a couple of years, I guess, has had on global supply chains. And so we see a lot of shortages, a lot of down manufacturing in various parts of the world. And so that's driving up prices for a lot of things. I mean, we heard, last year at various points about computer chip shortages, and that was affecting the number of cars that were being built. And so that places a premium on the price of cars, and it creates a very hot used car market. And similar stories in appliances and in building materials for the construction industry. Prices for all those things are going up because of these supply chain disruptions, and that's something that is not going to get resolved overnight. I think that is going to continue to have a positive effect on the inflation rate and keep inflation high, probably well into next year, if not even 2023 and beyond.
That's a really good, thoughtful breakdown, and I think it's important that we see the inflation issue from a variety of perspectives. For the folks who listen to this podcast, many of whom are involved in policy making or business planning, it's clear to me that this is an issue it's transcending economics now, and it's sort of hitting Main Street, where ordinary people often can't necessarily feel the difference between 4.2% and 4.8% inflation over a short period. But you're seeing a discussion these days of people saying it is costing me a lot more to fill my tank, buy groceries, and buy bikes for my kids and that kind of thing. And I think that's one of those areas where we really need to think about the people impact as well as the economic one. So on that front, I'd love you to marry up two topics for me that I know you spent some time talking about. The first is Canada's stagnant productivity and therefore relatively stagnant real wage growth, with the prospect of lingering high inflation, and how the combination of those two things can create an outcome that could be potentially very nasty that we'd want to avoid. Paint that doomsday scenario for us.
Oh, tough question. I mean, I think the productivity issue is kind of a longer term trend that we've seen issues for several years now leading up to the pandemic. And I think the things that we've identified as far as what will help to increase our productivity and thus see wage growth is the kinds of things that are long-term big picture thinking. So for instance, one of the areas in which Canada really lags is R&D and innovation. And kind of related to that, part of it comes down to having a relatively large share of smaller corporations compared with large corporations. Now, the reason why larger corporations are more productive and do see more research and innovation is a little bit of an open question, but I think part of it comes down to just having more resources to be able to do things on the scale to really drive those big changes, right? That ultimately drives productivity growth, not just for their business or even their industry, but across the economy Canada-wide. How that lines up with the inflation challenge, I think, is that, on the one hand, we've got folks who are not seeing their wages grow very much, if at all, right now. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, we've got prices rising. So I think very quickly, we all of a sudden get to a point where Canadians care a whole lot about metrics like inflation and wage growth because they're feeling it, right? And so, I hope if anything good does come out of this, it is to focus more and more on productivity and wage growth, and to realize how harmful it is, right, to see that ultimately stagnate for several years.
Right. You got close to the word that I was trying to tempt you into, which was stagflation, because I think that's the real concern is if you got to a point where wages are staying stagnant, but inflation is increasing, then people's real purchasing power ability declines. And I don't think we're necessarily there yet, but I think as you've identified, there is, it focuses an important point on why we need a long-term growth strategy for this country, because if wages are increasing, inflation is much less concerning and much less problematic, and even in some cases good for working people.
So as we kind of close our conversation, I want to take a little bit of a step back. For the past 2 years, COVID has been this gray cloud over every conversation, every news story. Every bit of good employment news is like, this is great, but COVID has the potential to totally disrupt this. Business growth news, commodity prices, labor, childcare, school, leisure, everything. What's your take on this latest variant and the impact that it might have on, our economy, on Albertans? What are you observing in the data?
Your question is funny because I get asked a lot on various other interviews that Alicia and I end up doing on the state of the Alberta economy, what we expect. And you kind of feel like a broken record after a while because you end up saying exactly what you just said. It's like, well, things look good. We have all these conditions. Our conditions are strong. We've got good commodity prices. People are moving into the province. We've got lots of investment activity happening here right now, but COVID. And so which kind of, you can throw a wrench in the gears at any point in time. And so, right now we're in a situation, we've got this Omicron variant that's spreading that, appears to be extremely contagious, but also appears to be slightly more mild. And it does unfortunately cast a shadow over what's happening in the Alberta economy because, you get the sense that we're fairly resistant to the idea of additional major significant lockdown measures, but to the extent that people are sick and they can't go to work or decide not to go out or are sick and therefore can't go out and just do their normal day-to-day things, like in this normalcy indicator that Alicia talked about, I mean, those do have a negative impact on the economy. And so and none of us have ever been through this before except for the last couple of years. So it really is an open question. So, we keep saying that, things look good, but you never know what's going to happen. And this huge spike that we saw is exactly one of those. And so if we look ahead, to places that experienced this spike earlier, so in Ontario and Quebec, which beat us to the punch to Omicron by a few weeks, their cases appear to be starting to come down, but we don't really yet know how much of that is real and how much of it is the virus burning itself out and what kind of an impact this is going to have on the economy going forward.
I think one maybe more uplifting thing to keep in mind when you think about us now versus a year ago is we're in a totally different place than we were a year ago, even if it doesn't feel like it when we think about the percentage of the population that's vaccinated, right? A year ago, we were at 0% roughly, give or take. Now we're at 75% has at least one dose in Alberta. We have different treatments for the virus, even for folks who choose not to get vaccinated. We know more too about which regulations and restrictions are maybe too costly or are not effective. So I think that we are, even though it feels like the same old, just new variant, I think we are in a very different place. We've learned a lot. And so I think this upcoming year is about thinking about, how do we use the lessons that we've learned so that we don't, when we hear about a new variant, just rush to put up a travel ban when we know that they're not ineffective and we know that they're costly, right? We take what we learn and we quote unquote build back better, right? Like learn from our mistakes, learn from the new information that we have, the changing situation.
Yeah, I think that's actually, you're completely right. And I tend to err on the side of pessimistic responses to some of these questions.
I'm glad you said it. Err on the side of gloomy economic pessimism.
Well, yeah, it's like what you do. But Alicia's right, though. We have learned a lot, and I think we're at a point where everybody is expecting that this is we're going to have to transition our expectations from pandemic to endemic. And vaccination rates are higher. People are, there are still concerns out there, and there are still huge risks. But people have, part of a risk is the fear of the unknown, right? And so this is no longer an unknown that we're dealing with. And so I think that for some people at least, relaxes them. It makes, remember if at the beginning of 2020, there was a lot of fear, a lot more fear than there is now, because we didn't know what to expect. And now we do know what to expect to some degree. And, hopes that we're dealing with a less dangerous variant. Some people think that might signal the burning out of the real danger associated with this. And if that's the case, then we can look forward to a continued gradual build back. And when there is a new variant that pops up, it won't have the same kind of debilitating effect that it had in past waves.
Do you have any predictions on what shifts and how we maybe understand economic data and economic indicators? Do you have any predictions of like what might be permanent? Are there any shifts that you are observing that might kind of stick around post this, endemic phase?
Well, I mean, one of them is going to be this interesting question about how much we continue to rely on going back into the office for people that work in a place where they do have the luxury of working from home. I mean, not everybody does, but if you do, I think it's a very personal response to that. Some people love working from home. Some people hate it. Some people want a mix of the two. And how that plays out, depends on workers' preferences. It depends on employers' preferences, and those vary significantly from one person and one employer to the next. And so, how that all plays out is a question that I'm looking forward to watching unfold.
I think two big changes as far as the economic data goes is I think there's going to continue to be a more heavy reliance on indicators that are more in real time. I think we've seen how much there is a need and also how much this data is available and we can get it. Right. So I think that's going to stick. The other thing that I think is going to stick and going to continue to grow is more demographic information. I think we've seen just how truly important it is, right? Even the Federal Reserve in the US is now tracking unemployment rate of Black Americans, right? And so I think we're going to see that continue more into the future, more investment in that area as well. So I think overall, my hope, and I think this will be true, is better data and more frequently collected.
Yeah, agree. Final question for you both. If there is one idea or one insight, both the economy, employment, anything that you would like to leave our listeners with, what is that?
So my big thing when I think about 2 years ago versus now is that we've learned a lot, right? It's put us all in these really uncomfortable and sometimes really horrible positions and situations, but we've really had to think differently, do things differently. And so I think it's almost kind of a challenge to all of us as Albertans, whether we're in the private sector, public sector, nonprofit sector, is to think about what can we learn from what we did differently that worked actually quite well, that we can maybe build on and carry forward, whether that's related to, mental health, remote access to mental health, right? You don't necessarily need to drive to an office if you are out in rural Alberta, say, and don't have access to a counselor. There are all sorts of things that I think we've learned to do differently and better that I think we should really take a step back and actually think about how can we build on those. So I think that's my biggest point of reflection and insight.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Mike, what's your take?
Well, I hate to do this because Scott's going to jump all over me, but I have to be slightly pessimistic and concerned again about things. The one for me is how we work as a society going forward. I think that one of the downsides to what's happened over the last couple of years is that it's magnified an existing trend of polarization in terms of political ideology, in terms of views on vaccination, in terms of, social integration. We see this as an example, this question of Quebec deciding to or wanting to impose a tax on the unvaccinated. And so this, which, is a controversial move to make for sure. And that sort of, that divisiveness that we're starting to see, we haven't seen for a while, but we're starting to see more of it. And people are being more unapologetic, more intransigent, and less willing to listen to one another like colleagues and friends and human beings, and are more content to sling arrows at each other from trenches of their own echo chamber. And so that's something that I'm watching to see and hoping settles with time.
Yeah. I mean, the line that, I use all the time, probably more consistently than I should, is that the COVID has really magnified a lot of the things that kind of were just simmering below the surface COVID has just magnified. And I think those polarizations and those divisions, COVID's really shone a light on some of that, almost created a bit of a magnifying glass effect. And now things are heating up a little bit. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us for this kind of tour de force of the state of the economy and sharing your insights on, lessons learned and things to watch out for this year. So thank you both for your time.
No problem. We could talk about economics and these kinds of things all day.
We love
nerding. We do.
We totally do.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta. You can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And if you liked this episode and want to support our message of shared prosperity for all, please be sure to head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts to subscribe, rate the show, and give us a quick review. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.